Hi, my name is Amanda, and my presentation is entitled Climate Change, Carbon Emissions, Who and How. When considering climate change, there are several issues to contend with, but the ethical issue I'm wanting to address is how far do we go to mitigate climate change and carbon emissions? There is an interesting viewpoint that can either help or hinder this question, and a group of youth climate activists took this question to the courts. Is the atmosphere considered a public trust? This court case is Juliana versus the United States, and the complaint, and I quote, asserts that through the government's affirmative actions that cause climate change, it has violated the youngest generation's constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property, as well as failed to protect essential public trust resources. First filed in 2015, it has made its way through the courts and will be taken to the Supreme Court with this new administration. However, it brings up the question, even if the Supreme Court dismisses the lawsuit, as human beings, should we have an ethical obligation to mitigate climate change for the sake of future generations? And next, we have to determine what we need to do and how. So, there is a global consensus to decrease carbon emissions, but many issues arise from who has to and how much. In the U.S., we follow market-based approaches to dealing with carbon mitigation in order to allow the private sectors the flexibility to determine how they reduce their carbon emissions. This is through the use of carbon taxes or cap and trade. So, with a cap and trade, the private sector is saying companies have a limit to the amount of carbon they can emit, but then there is an open market to trade credits for more carbon emissions. So larger companies benefit from this system while smaller companies do not. Then there are some economists who are in favor of a grandfather clause, which would allow large carbon emitters to continue to emit large quantities of carbon because there is reasoning that a decrease in carbon emissions for these companies or countries would result in an unhealthy economy. This not only hurts poor areas in the country, but on a larger scale, it also negatively impacts developing countries. These countries will be more prone to flooding, disease, and relocation. This so-called economic burden of humanitarian aid across the globe may be the wake-up call that spurs large-scale action of decreasing carbon emissions in developed countries that would result from these developing countries needing help. Current environmental policies include the Clean Air Act, which works in conjunction with the EPA to decrease greenhouse gases. There are energy policy laws in place that partner with the Department of Energy to come up with clean energy. There are voluntary agreements in place at the international level. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was enacted to create mandatory enforceable targets to reduce greenhouse emissions for participating countries, but is no longer in action. The Paris Climate Agreement is also a voluntary agreement enacted in 2015, but with the Biden-Harris administration, they've already rejoined. In my opinion, current environmental policies in the U.S. lack funding to make significant headway, especially if the private sector has the flexibility to control their carbon emissions. So, for example, in 2020, the EPA took a significant funding cut, and many aspects of its agency started to feel the strain. The voluntary agreements are great in theory, and while the Kyoto Protocol had mandatory and enforceable targets, the U.S. didn't join, and it excluded growing economies in countries like China. The Paris Climate Agreement doesn't have a way to enforce the pledges made by the signatory countries. In order to address this ethical issue, I believe that the 3 E's could be a good approach to take in terms of climate sustainability. By looking at climate change and carbon emissions and the impacts they have on the environment, economy, and equity, it can help spur the call to action. Despite the court ruling in Juliana versus the United States, the environment, specifically the atmosphere in this case, should be viewed as a public trust. This would enable the federal government to have more say in how the private sectors are trying to reduce their carbon emissions. The economy can look for more ways to switch to green or clean energy by raising the carbon fee, which would then create the necessity to switch over to different energy sources. This would also create more U.S. jobs, leading to equity. More jobs could help lower income classes. Cleaner energy would also ensure that developing countries are taken into account, as they are the ones who will bear the brunt of climate change-related crises. Where do we go from here? I believe that the best way to start would be to add on to the policies we already have in place. If we raise carbon fees or taxes, that revenue could be used to help fund the research that is being done to create clean energy sources through the energy policy laws at more consumer-friendly prices. It is a sad reality that large and quick changes would be met with many adversaries in our country. So working slowly to prove switching over to clean renewable energy or green sources of energy as the best option should be the plan of action. Another step would be to back the Biden-Harris administration as it aims to pause getting into new oil and natural gas leases in order to double efforts into renewable energy. We then need to hold this administration accountable to these new executive orders. As stakeholders in the health of our climate, we need to have an active voice in how our government is working to decrease carbon emissions and do our part to limit our carbon footprint. Thank you.